Thank you for joining us. Molly, you have host permissions, right?
Yeah, all good now.
Excellent. If anybody can't hear me, then just let us know. I believe that everybody is muted upon entry. So if and when there is any point that you have a question or would like to say something, you might need to unmute yourself in order to be able. So first of all, welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us. We're lucky enough to have Colonel Wilkerson and Colonel Edgar both joining us for what will hopefully be an interesting, approximately hour-long conversation. I'll just briefly introduce both of our speakers, and then what we'll do is we'll give our speakers the opportunity to make remarks for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions for anybody that might have any questions. So once again, thank you to everybody for taking the time to join us today. Just to introduce our speakers briefly, so Colonel Wilkerson is a retired U.S. Army officer, and Colonel Edgar and Wilkerson, please excuse me, I'm introducing brief versions of your biography because I think if I introduce the whole thing, but that would be the entirety of the event. So Colonel Wilkerson is a retired U.S. Army officer, a 31-year veteran, and the former Chief of Staff to Colin Powell, both when he was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as Secretary of State. He later served as the Associate Director of the State Department Policy Planning Staff and was a former Director of the U.S. Marine Corps College at Quantico. Since retirement, he's taught National Security Affairs at the Honors Program at George Washington University and is currently working on a book on the first George W. Bush administration. I hope I covered everything. Colonel Edgar is a retired U.S. Army infantry officer and also a 22-year veteran of the Armed Forces. He currently is the Associate Director of the William P. Clements Jr. Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern languages and cultures from the University of Texas. Colonel Edgar served extensively across the region, including in Operation Iraqi Freedom as a security advisor to Vice Admiral Red in the Coalition Provisional Authority, as well as a battalion operations and executive officer. He conducted counterinsurgency and combat operations in Iraq, as well as in Afghanistan, was the executive assistant to the commander of the Kingdom of Jordan's Special Operations Command, and in his final position in the military, was a political advisor for Israeli affairs to the United States Security Coordinator in Jerusalem. So what I think we'll do now is we'll hand the mic perhaps to Colonel Wilkerson first, and then afterwards to Colonel Edgar to make remarks on the topic that we will be covering in today's lecture. So Colonel Wilkerson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me add one thing. For 15 years now, I've been teaching at the nation's oldest public university, the College of William and Mary. So that's the one I tout the most, if you will. We are going through right now, as are all universities, schools, colleges in America, a really trying time because we're public. Maybe more trying than, say, Harvard or Stanford or whatever. We operate on a very thin margin. And with that opener, recently at William & Mary, just 3 weeks ago, I concluded my semester with my graduate seminar with a capstone exercise. And that exercise, at their request, because we were going to look at a different crisis altogether when we started this semester, but at their request, we changed it to the immediate crisis, that is the coronavirus. And it was intriguing for me to watch these young people go through almost 3 hours of deliberation, role-playing a principals committee. Now, the principals committee is headed by the National Security Advisor to the President and is composed of all the cabinet officers and agency heads who have a dog in the fight, so to speak. So in this case, for example, you had the Secretary for Health and Human Services, you had the Secretary of Defense, you had the Secretary of State, you had the Surgeon General, and so forth. All the characters that you would think would be assembled. And their mission was to develop a course of action or courses of action to hand to the NSC with the President sitting, and to make a decision. In other words, they would come up with courses of action that the NSC would look at and the president would make a decision. The most intriguing and insightful aspect of the discussion was caused by the fact that the Deputies Committee, which is right below the Principals Committee in our decision-making structure, had handed them 3 courses of action that were unclassified and one that was classified. Well, the classified one became a very intense part of the discussion because it involved a very analytical approach to 2 questions. One, did you really want to save a lot of lives? And 2, if saving those lives in the short term caused domestically and internationally far more loss of life because of the damage done to the global economy. This caused, as you might imagine, some real ethical considerations to enter their discussions and debate, and gave me more insights probably than anything else they did. Suffice to say that much of their discussion was couched in what I would call standard post-World War II American international liberalism, which is they talk, for example, about how to help others, like Iran, like Egypt, like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, and so forth, and other countries in the world too, not just in the Middle East or Southwest Asia. But that was a part of their consideration, which we remarked afterwards in the sort of after-action review, doesn't seem to be a part of the current discussion with the Trump administration, or if it is, it's a very insignificant part of the discussion. So one of the insights I took out of this exercise, and it has been an insight that I've gathered ever since President Trump was inaugurated, is that there's a real tension amongst my students. Now, they range from 19 to 26, 27. My graduate students come from across the country. They basically are very tense, very irritated by, very much angered in some senses with what the United States is doing in terms of its more or less insular approach. And one of the previous crises that we discussed was the situation in Iran. And of course, it was right in the semester, it was very close to the assassination of Soleimani, the head of the IRGC at the time. And it occasioned a discussion about Iran, which involved the sort of thing that we had in the George W. Bush administration, the sort of discussion we had there when the earthquake struck Iran, BAM, in 2003, as I recall. And that discussion was amongst Secretary Powell, myself, the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, the Deputy Secretary, and others, that we should do something. The United States should do something. This was right up our alley. We should do something. We did not even have to, the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, did not even have to, he didn't have to persuade President Bush. President Bush, some of the scenes coming in from that area, he knew the damage that was being done, or approximately. And so we sent everything we could. We sent search dogs, we sent search and rescue teams, fire departments across the country volunteered to send people to Iran to help with that earthquake and so forth. So it was a very different situation at that time with a president that people immediately after he left office came to sort of not care for too much because of his other than humanitarian, if you will, attitude. One of the aspects of my president, George W. Bush, and I'm making no claims for him, I served him, but one of the things that he's remembered for, when he's remembered positively, is his approach to HIV/AIDS, for example. And the one place where he can go in the world, where almost every leader or post-leader, previous leader, recognizes him and applauds him, is Africa. Especially sub-Saharan Africa, because of his contributions to not only the global HIV/AIDS fund, but also the U.S. fund. So an unknown feature of George W. Bush, largely, that he was an internationalist in that sense, certainly in a humanitarian sense. What I did after that exercise was I took a look at the region to see exactly how the virus was impacting it. The 22 Arab countries, Afghanistan, other places that I've been involved with for some time. And I wanted to see just how things were going there. And I know that's part of what we want to do today, so I'd just like to make some general comments. First, it looks as if the virus is being used by authoritarian, draconian, other less than democratic governments to increase their hold on their people. This might be expected, but it is something that is coming out of this, I think. It's probably not restricted just to the Southwest Asia and the Middle East. A second thing that I've noticed is that it's a very rough record, if you will, of what's happening. I took a look yesterday at what most journalists and others are saying in terms of their reporting with regard to the region. And I just some examples here. Iran is looking at about 130,000 cases, 7,200 deaths already. These are approximate figures, of course, and one has to wonder if the reporting is as good as it should be under the circumstances. And I'll quickly add that I'm wondering about my own country in that regard, too. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, something like profits are down for Saudi Aramco by 25% in the first quarter. The Yemen war, the drag on Saudi Arabia's finances, the drop in oil prices, and so forth, really affecting Mohammed bin Salman and his rule there. Probably Vision 2030 is in danger. In Yemen, 169, 29 deaths, which surprised me, and yet I'm sitting here thinking that if I'm in Yemen, I'm looking up and here's a Raytheon provided 250 to 500 pound bomb headed at me. And oh, on the backside of me is the coronavirus. So in Yemen right now, or cholera, in Yemen right now, the situation is really dire. Maybe a positive impact of this coronavirus might be that Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and others will have to look seriously at the political solution to that conflict. In Syria, I was surprised to see, although I'd heard this was a low case load right now, 58 cases, 3 deaths. But I'm wondering about the refugee camps, which seem to be ripe for the coronavirus. Should it get there and should it impact them? In Egypt, 14,000 plus cases, 680 dead. In Afghanistan, 8,187 dead. Kabul, Herat, and Kandahar seem to be the hot points. In Morocco, 7,000 cases, 194 dead, and so forth. And then this morning, I had an opportunity to listen to Brian Hook for a moment on Iranian Royal TV, based in Los Angeles. And I didn't listen to the entire thing. I'll go back and listen to it. But I listened to enough of it to know that now this is Royal TV, to know that the United States has no intention, regardless of some comments which might be being made about the ability to get humanitarian assistance despite the sanctions and so forth. The United States has no intentions of releasing any pressure in the so-called maximum pressure campaign. And if this is the ultimate result, that the Iranian regime collapses, so be it. One of the things I discussed with a couple of Iranian experts just the other day was what happens if the most likely result of a collapsed government in Tehran occurs. All you have to do is look a little bit at history to understand what I mean. The guys with the guns are the people who usually pick up the pieces after a government falls. The guys with the guns are the IRGC, empowered more so, even with the death of Soleimani, empowered more so since the US mistakes in the region, like the invasion of Iraq and so forth, empowered them. So I asked the question of these experts, what happens? How does the United States deal with the IRGC? How does the United States deal with the military dictatorship in Iran? Won't happen, they said, to a man, to a woman. Won't happen. I reminded them in 1978 and 79, when I was in the military, that that's what the intelligence community was telling us about the Shah and his stability, that he was stable and so forth and so on, and only a few months later he was gone. Only to point out to them that uncertainty is a key feature of this virus, a key feature of the world right now, and that we had no plan whatsoever, apparently, to deal with that sort of a denouement in Iran should the regime collapse. I suspect that what this president will do is clap his hands and say, we had a beautiful regime change in Tehran and it's all over, and turn his attention to Venezuela or some other place where he wants regime change or where his staff wants regime change. I'm really disappointed that I don't see any kind of planning at all for dealing with what might happen in Iran right now, because all my sources are telling me that the situation is truly dire. Not just because of the sanctions, but because the government, the theocracy, has lost the support of even the lower 1/3 of Iranian society, that 1/3 that basically was for it for so long a time. So the theocracy really has no support at all, other than the guns and those who get their livelihood, rich as it is sometimes, even with the sanctions and so forth, from the very thing we're talking about, the authoritarian government, the corruption and the crime and so forth. The situation in Iran, to me, is the situation in that part of the world. Many other problems exist: Russia in Syria, Israel attacking targets in Syria now almost with impunity. The other things that we talk about all the time with regard to Southwest Asia and the Middle East. But Iran is my focus right now. And some of the insights that came out of my students dealing with that crisis, for example, their conclusion at the end of their NSC meeting, which they simulated, was that some sort of rapprochement with Iran must be effected, that is to say, between the United States and Iran. And Saudi Arabia must be brought into that, and if she doesn't want to be brought into that, tough. One of the things I'm rather satisfied with right now is President Trump's apparent backing away from Mohammed bin Salman and from Saudi Arabia in general. If I were in Tehran and I were a Jeffersonian democracy, I would have an even more intense problem with Riyadh than I do now. So I think that some sort of rapprochement with Tehran is an essential to bringing eventually some sort of stability and prosperity to that region. I'll just close with that.
Thank you, Colonel Wilkerson. Thank you for those remarks, and now we'll move on to Colonel Edgar, who will give us his take on the issues being discussed.
Hi. So first of all, thanks to you all for having me, and Colonel Wilkerson, your reputation precedes you. I'm sorry that we've never had a chance to meet. I do believe we overlapped in Iraq in the early years, 2004, during Colin Powell's visits. I don't know for a fact if you were visiting while he came through a few times, but in my interactions with him while working in the Coalition Provisional Authority, we may have had a chance to at least be in the same office together for a moment. But it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to be on this forum with you. And then, thanks to Shlomo and the rest of you with the Cambridge Middle East and North Africa Forum. Thanks for your interest in this region. Thanks for your concerns for its stability and development, and the West's relationship to it, because it's an incredibly important area, as we all know. And it's not something that goes away because it's uncomfortable or because it's complicated. It's something that you've got to engage and connect with and understand better, and in order to produce better relationships and better outcomes. I'll also say that my experience tends to be in the Middle East a little significantly lower, at a lower level than Colonel Wilkerson's. He has incredible experience working with senior leaders. Much of mine has been what I would call government middle management, whether it would be diplomatic middle management or military middle management. So I think I bring a different perspective, maybe some color commentary. But when it comes to to senior decision making, senior considerations, I think Colonel Wilkerson has me hands down. So so hopefully what I have to offer will perhaps round up some of the things that that he has said. I'll also talk briefly about the COVID crisis and what I've done with my students here at the University of Texas. What we've done is with our undergraduate fellows in the Clements Center, what we've done is take the opportunity to study sort of the anatomy of a crisis. I have told my students that this is not their last crisis. This is maybe their first one, or the first one that they remember. And the others that will come after this one may not be or will not be the same. In fact, if we don't have another pandemic in their lifetime, that would not be terribly unusual. But there are some things that are similar between crises, and we've tried to focus on those things. And one example is that we've spent a lot of time talking about every crisis, or every policy crisis that is associated with a crisis is also, and perhaps most importantly, or arguably most importantly, an intelligence problem. And when I say that, I don't mean that it's a problem for the intelligence services, for the CIA or anything like that, but that it's a problem of trying to figure out what is really going on, what really is the nature of this virus in particular, how it's spreading, how we can contain it, how we can control it, how we can't, how far away is a vaccine. Those are, in my, the way I describe things, those are intelligence problems, even again, if they don't fit within an intelligence service, that a government has to struggle with and go after aggressively in order to sort out better what it's dealing with, and in order to address it and address its changing policies, because a crisis, right? A crisis, you don't normally nail it the first time. You've got to develop your response over time and fine tune it. So that's one example of how we here at the Clements Center at the University of Texas are trying to take this as an educational opportunity, and not just an opportunity to catch up on Netflix and things like that. So a little, and maybe I'll add just a couple more details on my professional and academic background, again, so I can show you how my perspective, or what I have to offer is different. So spent a lot of time with Jordan's Special Operations Command. This was during the Arab Spring. So I saw that from several different perspectives. Spent a few years in Iraq at different points during our occupation of that country. Spent a fair amount of time in Kuwait, and then also in Israel, where I studied at the university, at Tel Aviv University for a few years in a master's program that focused on Jewish literature, more or less from Iron Age through the Crusades. And then after I retired, or excuse me, right before I retired, I worked with Shlomo and the Israeli government, primarily the IDF and their coordinator in the territories. And our essentially our man, train, and equip mission to the Palestinian Authority. And this is an agreement, some of you may know about this, but it's an agreement between the U.S. government, the Israeli government, and the Palestinian Authority, where the U.S. participates, funds the development of professionalized law enforcement organizations that are responsive to the Palestinian Authority in order to help with the security situation, primarily in the West Bank. And this is all following the Second Intifada, after the what was Arafat's security forces in the West Bank had, to say they were decimated is an understatement during that period. they inflicted lots of damage as well. Don't get me wrong, but they needed rebuilding if they were going to stabilize and become a fair partner with Israel and try to move peace forward. So I was involved with that, and then I recently, relatively recently, about 6 years ago, came to the University of Texas. And was fortunate enough after I got my degree to land a job here in security studies. So that's the connection with you all and with Shlomo. My broad observations on COVID in the Middle East is that, of course, and this is not news, that it's making life much more difficult, much more painful for many. But overall, I would also say, as dramatically as we feel this event right now, as sharp as it is to all of us, because we're all experiencing it to some degree. Overall, I think as time passes, we'll find that even though it's severe, that this crisis is incremental. I don't think that it will profoundly reshape national or international politics. There will be incremental shifts, and then I'll make one comment about Iran at the end, because that is not my area of specialty at all. And as an example, Sisi's health minister in Egypt, Haass Zayed, she said, I think it was this past weekend, I may have the date wrong, but she announced that essentially that Egypt needs to learn to coexist with the virus until there's a cure. And I think you're going to find more governments, not just in the Middle East, but everywhere. And I think you see this a little bit in the United States right now as well, that this is going to be the attitude that that becomes predominant. And it's not a matter of not caring. It's not a matter of sort of apathy. But simply of the reality that this thing has gone so far, we were not able to contain it in time, that there is nothing to do other than coexist with it, doing our best to work around it until there is a cure, until there is treatment, or until there's enough immunity that it is far less of a problem than it is now. And again, when I say these things, I don't want to minimize the suffering that it's inflicting, but simply that this will be more and more the overt attitude of governments around the Middle East, and even to some degree around the world. And I think this recognizes the limits of government. I think this is a recognition of Sisi or Zayed or whoever else that may take this attitude, that it understands the limit of government in Egypt or elsewhere in the Middle East, elsewhere in the world, to really get something like this under control, especially after it's already gone so far. I think Colonel Wilkerson is right. He said a number of things about healthcare systems are or will be further overwhelmed. I think that that's of course the case. We're already seeing that. They'll be overwhelmed for a couple or several months even. Economies will be depressed further. There will be fewer people in the oil fields to operate, both management and workers in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. One of the things, though, that's also worth noting is that reporting is bad, and that doesn't mean that people are intentionally reporting badly, but there's understanding what to report, understanding who to report to, understanding who to gather information from in all of these countries, even in the United States, is not going to be consistent. It's not going to be the same. So they don't know the extent of the problem. We don't know the extent of the problem. So when we hear some of the numbers, especially, for example, out of Syria, that's not reflective of the problem of Syria, or at least not accurately reflective of the problem in Syria. It's more reflective of the problem of reporting in Syria, of the problem of simply gathering good data in Syria, and that's why numbers are low there. I'll also say this, though. One of the reasons why I say that this, in the big picture, in a few years, I think we'll look back and say that this is an incremental shift or an incremental a problem, although again we feel it very severely now, is that the Middle East consists of incredibly resilient people. They will overcome this, and it may not be pretty. It may be very, very ugly in certain places. In certain, for example, in Cairo and in large cities, it may not be pretty at all for several months, but they'll overcome. And I think it also reflects a capacity of the people of the Middle East to bear burdens themselves, rather than expecting governments or other institutions to bear it for them. So I think resilience. I think we ought to appreciate the resilience of these various peoples, these various countries, and those who live in them, and factor that into our anticipation of how they'll respond and how they will come out the other side. Colonel Wilkerson and I have very similar views on the U.S. place in the world, what it ought to be doing, what it has done in the past. So I won't add to that. I think there's much more that we could and ought to be doing right now, and as many, I am. While I may understand very much the argument for the current administration, I have difficulty accepting what is going on is really the best, most productive response. And then I did say that I would mention Iran, and for that I'll simply defer to Colonel Wilkerson. This may be the place. This may be the place where the shift, even if it's incremental, they are so close to a breaking point in certain respects that this pushes them over the top, and that we see something that's very, very different coming out the other side. And I think those are really, really interesting comments that Colonel Wilkerson made, and I look forward to watching over the next several months to see how that plays out in Iran. So that's a summary of again of my experience, and my assessment, I think, of overall where this will lead us, or where this will lead the Middle East in the next when we look back in 3, 4, 5 years.
Thank you, Colonel Edgar, for the insightful comments. It was really interesting to hear from both of you. As Colonel Edgar mentioned at the beginning, Colonel Wilkerson, your involvement at the higher levels of diplomatic, political, and military decision making, and you, Colonel Edgar, what you defined as middle management, and what I would define as very concrete, on the ground experience in some of the most interesting places in the region. What we'll do now is we'll open the floor to questions. Everybody is muted, so if you have a question, just make sure to unmute yourself. And considering that we're all over Zoom and this is not a live event, it makes everything a little more difficult and awkward. But if you could just introduce yourself quickly, what part of the world you're from, what your name is, and then if we could just keep questions directed at either speaker or of course both.
The question is, first of all, I want to compliment the speakers, because I learned a lot about Iran that I didn't know. And it looks to me as if we may have a Kermit Roosevelt situation, which I'd never thought of before. But the thing that is puzzling me is how Israel's annexation policy is steering the pot when we've got enough troubles in the world without throwing something else in. So the question is, Why is Israel doing this at this particular time?
Thank you, Martin. I take the question is addressed at both speakers.
I'll take that from a more or less National Security Council presidential level, if you will. I have to go back to George W. Bush and a discussion in the Oval with regard to what was going to happen in his administration, at least the first term, with regard to U.S. Israel policy, broadly called the Middle East peace process. It was a very to the point discussion. It essentially said, nothing has worked for 40 years. Therefore, I'm going to give, at that point, Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, his head. He then called Sharon into the Oval Office, you may recall, and at the end of the meeting called him a man of peace, which didn't go over very big with those elements opposed to Israel in the region. After all, this is the guy who had more or less orchestrated the invasion of Lebanon, which we had to bail Israel out from in 82 and 83. 243 some odd Marines were killed in a hotel there and so forth. Torturous comments in many respects. But that set the path, and we've seen it ever since. Colin Powell tried to go to Ramallah, for example, meet with Arafat. Dick Cheney cut the limb Colin Powell crawled off in Washington, so it didn't have any results. And that's where we have been ever since. And I think this administration has put the absolute catalyst, accelerant, whatever you want to call it, to this policy. The policy is, Mr. Netanyahu, you can do anything you want to. And Mr. Netanyahu has some very grand plans for what he wants to do. And it includes everything from annexation of the Golan to turning Jerusalem into the Israeli capital, period, to an end to what was for 40 years a failed policy, to be sure, but was the Middle East peace process. There is no peace process anymore that I can detect. It's all a process of letting Mr. Netanyahu and the conservatives, particularly the ultra-conservatives in the Israeli government, do what they want to do. You can argue, as President Bush did, that that's a new attempt, a new way of dealing with things. Let's see if the Israelis can settle the situation we're looking at, I think, today, and in many respects. And it's your view, questioner, all the rest of you listening, it's your view as to whether or not that's a sound policy or not. But I think that is, in a nutshell, our policy.
Right, I'd agree that since the Trump administration came in, the disposition towards Israel and Palestine has changed prominently. Maybe very overtly. And I guess to get back to your, I think that's exactly why now, is because everybody is consumed with so many other things. If in Netanyahu's view, if this is something that he turns into actual policy, something that is effective policy, and not just a more sort of demagoguery, then there's less capacity around the world, less ability to address it, and to whether addressing it is simply rhetorical, or whether addressing it would involve some sort of sanctions from countries who are very seriously, principally, in a principled way, very seriously against annexation of anything in the West Bank. So that's, I think the timing is deliberate, but I think maybe the bigger question is whether this can become effective policy, or whether it just continues to be more rhetoric. And Netanyahu is the Israeli government it has been stretched, right, the last 18 plus months with multiple elections, and now a government like none other before. So you know, what will this particular government be capable of doing over the time that it's able to hold itself together? Those are some of the other questions I think to ask. You know, further down the road than that, it doesn't become a viable policy for the long term. And I think that's, you know, especially for those of us who are really for those of us who are really passionate about seeing Israel succeed and thrive, not just today, not just tomorrow, but for decades and centuries, right? For those of us who are really passionate about Israel doing well, many of us are concerned that this kind of a policy over the long term really implodes in several different ways, and you know, I'm sure that you're familiar of the different criticisms of what a long-term policy of annexation or a long-term policy of just ignoring the Palestinians' right to sovereignty. You know, it just, those are impossible obstacles in my mind, at least. Maybe I'm wrong, but those are impossible obstacles to overcome. So I don't see the policy, if he is able to implement it, working over the long term. And when I say long term, I mean, you know, several decades, not simply his administration or the next.
Thank you for that question, Martin. If anybody else has an additional question, feel free to jump in with it.
So my name is Naaman. I'm part of the MENAF committee, and I'm currently in Stockholm. I'm curious about, in terms of foreign aid to the region, since a lot of the American foreign aid has been mostly military aid, and whereas China has been moving in more on medical equipment and so on, whether or not other countries, actually like the EU, Russia, whether or not they'll be able to seize upon the opportunity in a sense, and perhaps shift the balance a bit towards them.
The battle going on right now, even with this administration, which has become incredibly insular in many respects, between what you might call the shibboleth in the world, the Chinese Belt Road Initiative, the trillion of dollars funded Chinese initiative, and the US attempt to thwart that initiative, to fight it everywhere it can, to become the benefactor rather than China and so forth, it is a colossal struggle right now. Secretary Esper, the Secretary of Defense, recently announced that China, he essentially declared a Cold War with China. Weapons acquisition, strategy, everything now is turned towards China. The Marine Corps just turned out its vision for the future. And its vision for the future is fewer F-35s, no artillery, no tanks. It's going to go to the Spratlys and the Paracels, and it's going to take them from China. That's the Marine Corps' objective. So this is a colossal struggle that doesn't have to happen, in my view. And yet we are predestining it. We're saying it's going to happen. Xi Jinping essentially is saying the same thing back. He's regained his stature in Beijing. A little bit tarnished after the coronavirus response and the accusations that were hurled at him from not just Washington, but other capitals too. He's regained that, and he's regained it largely on the fact of nationalism, of a xenophobia almost. And that's going to be the future, I think. We're looking at other aspects of humanitarianism and those things that we've come to expect after World War II to furnish that humanitarian help and so forth across the globe, struggling in the midst of this huge struggle. Is China really all that bad? Is it bad that they give money to sub-Saharan Africa? Is it bad that they have a port for 99 years in Sri Lanka? Is it bad that their blue water navy is now blue water and is in the Indian Ocean and all around? Who knows what the ultimate outcome of that will be? But I think part of the problem we have right now is identifying the places that need help and giving them genuine help, and not just a part of this competition between China and the United States. And it also has to be admitted that the United States, though it is often called penurious, is not in at least the last 50 years, because they never count the private things that go on that the United States leads the world in. When you look at the United States capacity, though, to do the kinds of things that China is doing and to put the dollars against those kinds of things, it's diminished. And it is diminishing, even with the prospects. China's going to have the first negative growth since about 1976. I'm hearing that we're going to have a 2 to 3% GDP drop for the first quarter, and probably the same thing for the second, and anticipated for the third. This is colossal economic setback. So what's that going to mean for humanitarianism and aid and so forth and so on? Colonel Edgar's comments about the region, the Middle East, Southwest Asia, being resilient and its people being resilient is absolutely right. They're going to have to be, I think. That doesn't mean China is, I understand the Chinese in Iran right now are up to 50,000. And that in the face of the Iranian knowledge that the Chinese probably brought the coronavirus with them, the 30,000 or so that were there beforehand. But they're still sending people and they're still working. What are we doing with our policy with respect to Iran? We are forcing them into Beijing's hands. They're becoming increasingly desperate, economically and otherwise, and we're forcing them into Beijing's hands. So I just want to paint that this future we're looking at is going to be defined in some respects, if not large respects, by this huge competition that we are developing with Beijing.
Colonel Edgar, was there anything you wanted to add before we jump to another question?
I'll see if I can add a little bit. I agree that that's the direction that we're heading, that it's absolutely unnecessary, that with really just a different disposition, not even a different volume of money, but simply a different diplomatic disposition towards many places in the world, that we could offset this, if not counter it entirely. I'll add, though, that and I don't want to say that I'm hopeful, but I think one of the probabilities for hope, maybe is a good way to put it, is even already many countries who have connected closely with China over the past 10, 20 years are understanding, or coming to understand, that that connections with the Chinese, that a deep relationship with the Chinese turns out differently than a deep relationship with the United States. Now, we have certainly caused more than our fair share problems in the world, but and I guess, let me take a little bit of a step backwards. Some of you may be very familiar with the Graham Greene novel, The Quiet American, right? And that's sort of the, at least in literary circles and in many other circles, that is the paradigm of the naive American trying to do good, and instead causing more problems than he solves in foreign countries. And there's some real truth to that the United States has done damage where it's often tried to do good, or done damage while it's doing good. But the Chinese struggle with very, very similar problems. They don't connect well. We talk often about Americans' incapacity to connect with people from another country, or to relate to people of other cultures in other parts of the world. And then there's lots of truth to that criticism. But there's also a lot of evidence to exactly the opposite, that in many respects we've learned a lot over the past 75 plus years of how to relate very respectfully to other places in the world. And the Chinese are learning those lessons as well. I'm not sure they're going to adapt, though, as much as we have, and we have much more adaptation that we could do. Again, I don't want to say that we've been ideal partners, but the Chinese are struggling as well. When you have, say you have 5,000 or 10,000 Chinese workers in, in an African country, how are they relating to the local population? Are they relating respectfully? Are they keeping to themselves entirely? What kinds of frictions build up, and what do the Chinese do in order to either allay those or prevent them, or ignore them and just say, hey, that's the cost of doing business with us, whether they say that overtly or not. So I think that the Chinese, with their Belt and Road and similar initiatives, I think they are struggling with more than we sometimes appreciate. And so this does not need to come out in their favor in the end, period. Whether it's humanitarian aid or more very directly economic development oriented. This does not need to come out in their favor in the disfavor of the international system, and the disfavor, in the United States, at least in our disfavor as well. I think there's still lots of room to maneuver, lots of room to improve things, and even improve our relations with China. That's a tough proposition right now. But is it going to be tough in 5 years, 10 years, et cetera, if we haven't already sort of stumbled into the Thucydides trap, as Colonel Wilkerson mentioned it? He didn't use those terms, but that's often sometimes the way we refer to it. I think there's still room to maneuver to prevent that.
Let me just add, if I can. When Richard Haass and I were doing policy planning talks in Beijing in the summer of 2001, one of our interlocutors was Wang Yi, who is now the foreign minister plenipotentiary, just a step away from the Politburo, and Shui Tenkai, who was the ambassador to the United States. And one of the things that concerns me right now, I agree with Colonel Edgar that we should be able to do this together. After all, the Chinese got a lot of money. And putting that money into global development is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's when they demand the submarine pins or whatever that it turns out to be different. Or as a Sudanese once said to me 2 weeks ago, hey, everything that the Chinese do is for China. It's them that own the bazaars. It's them that own the shoe shops. It's them that own the streets. I don't like that. But it's a good thing that could come out of this, out of all this development money, which China has abundantly. At the same time, I've noticed a difference between the Wang Yi and Shui Tenkai and others, particularly PLAN and PLA, the Chinese military, who are now retired, that were active when we were talking to them, and their attitudes. Their attitudes concern me. Their attitudes are more aggressive. Their attitudes are, put a carrier in the Taiwan Strait and we'll sink it. We're going to take Taiwan back. We won't do it by force. We'll just threaten them, and Taipei will say, okay, we give up. And then it'll be too late for you to do anything. These sorts of things. These conversations didn't happen in the summer of 2001. Maybe they were hiding them. And so it's become a different China in many respects. And that's, I do have some alarm about that.
Thank you to Naman for that question, and thank you to you both for those great answers. Well, I'll just ask if anybody has a final question that they would like to ask either of our speakers or both of them.
Shlomo, hi. This is Malik Dalan speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Professor Dakhla. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for this very interesting webinar and the presentations that were made. I do want to ask and push a little bit on the orientation of U.S. foreign policy towards China. And it is a rather broad question, but I still struggle to understand what is this articulation to both of you, like to your understanding in policy circles in the U.S., especially when the U.S. is sort of withdrawing from many multilateral engagements. And as we head towards the G20 meetings in sort of November, which will coincide also with the elections, it seems to me, in general, there is a bipartisan consensus, and some have described it as the emergence of a new Cold War. In your view, is there an articulation?
Take a shot at that. There was a very carefully thought out through two different political parties and their presidents policy with respect to China post rapprochement, if you will, affected by Kissinger and Nixon. And that was essential strategic competition, but cooperation. In other words, we recognized we had lots of overlapping interests, lots of common interests, and we had some interests that would be acerbic and even vitriolic from time to time. And so we would compete on those, and the winner would win and the loser would lose. But on the other things, which we felt outweighed those that were contentious, we would cooperate. We've changed that now. As I read this administration, our policy now is strictly strategic competition and may the best man win, and we're going to win. And this is expressed as things have become expressed in America of late with our military more than anything else. President Trump has taken it to the trade war and other aspects of our economic relations and financial relations, even currency relations. But nonetheless, the big elephant in the room is the U.S. military and conversely the Chinese military. I think this is very dangerous. I think it's extremely dangerous. We may be crafting a self-fulfilling prophecy, as Colonel Edgar said, Graham Allison's book more or less says. John Mearsheimer said to me recently, a realist par excellence from Chicago, there will be a war, Larry. There will be a war. It is inevitable. There will be a war. I don't think it is. I don't think it is at all. But I think if we keep on this kind of track, we're going to make sure there is.
Professor Dahlan, I think one of the questions that may have got caught off there at the end is, and correct me if I'm wrong, was, is there an articulation of this, of a policy or this policy? Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. So there, yes, there has been, but does that mean that it's representative of our policy? The national security strategy, both for President Obama and President Trump, do articulate, I think, an increasing response to we would say, and I think in some ways rightly, we would say that all we're doing is simply responding to a more militant, more aggressive China, and China would probably articulate that differently. But I think both Obama's national security strategy and Trump's articulate this. Now, do I think that really gets at what needs to be done or what ought to be done or even what we're doing? I don't think, as always, national security strategies do not necessarily reflect what we are doing. So I think you see both Republicans and Democrats, whoever ends up winning, our next presidential election, is going to inherit this, and both parties acknowledge or recognize, or maybe just accept, that is probably a better term, just accept that this is the way it is, the way it's going to be. Their responses, though, if you have somebody like Joe Biden come into office, rather than continuing very precisely what the Trump administration has been doing, There will be change. I think it would be incremental change. There would still be tough talk against China. There may be some more sort of small military pivots. But I think you've hit on something in that we haven't been able to articulate this thing thoroughly. It's sort of like there's a problem. We know there's a problem. We've said some things. We have articulated some things about it, but we really haven't. Almost like COVID, we're struggling with it, but we really haven't come to grips with what our response ought to be, and what the most constructive response ought to be. And I will once again I'll echo Colonel Wilkerson's sentiments that I don't think this has to end in war. This does not have to end in some sort of bizarre continuation of the war in the Pacific in 1945, except in a much more extreme, fast-paced, devastating way. So. But everybody's struggling with it, and I do wish that there was really a more deliberate effort to think this through more thoroughly, and to articulate those things that ought to be articulated. And then, of course, some of our policy is ought not to be public, and to maintain those things. I would like to see some level of continuity between administrations from every 4 years, because that's what this problem is going to require is a good policy with continuity, not what we've seen with Iran, right, where we have these really wild shifts back and forth. I think if you see that with China, it's going to aggravate things even more than they already are.
Thank you, Professor Dakhan, for that final question, and thank you again to both of our speakers, Colonel Wilkerson and Colonel Edgar, for joining us today and for your really interesting insights into the topics we discussed, the future of the region, and the way it's been handling the COVID-19 crisis. For those of you who might have missed anything or joined late, this event, as well as future events, will be posted on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube channel. I would encourage anybody who doesn't already follow us on Facebook, as well as I mentioned, our new YouTube channel, and as well as our Twitter channel, to follow us just to stay up to date. The majority, if not all of our events for the foreseeable future are going to be online, particularly considering the fact that the University of Cambridge recently announced that all events on campus would be held over the internet, such that there will be quite a few fascinating events coming up, and all of which will be accessible to everybody online. Before we end the event, just a few more points about some of the things that the Middle East and North Africa Forum has going on. The first thing which you all might find interesting is the Manara Journal, the most recent edition of which can be found on our Facebook as well as on our website. Our editor-in-chief, Molly, who's on the call, will be shortly releasing the theme for the coming journal, and we are always happy to have submissions from different universities, from different professional backgrounds. And I can tell you that the coming journal edition will, of course, heavily focus on the COVID-19 crisis and the way in which the Middle East and North Africa have been coping with it. So it would be great to of course, have you all subscribe as readers, but even more than that, if anybody wants to submit an analytical piece, a book review, all of that is welcome. Beyond that, a new project that we've been working on is a news update service for those of you who are busy at your day jobs, or for those of you who your day job is following the news in the region. We have a new news service which comes out on a weekly basis on Monday, covered by dedicated researchers that we have, as well as language specialists at the University of Cambridge and beyond, which cover the main events of the week in the region in Persian, in Arabic, in Hebrew, and in English, such that if you'd like to stay abreast of what's happening but don't have the time to do so, or would like to hear further insight into what's happening, that's something which I would encourage everybody to subscribe for. Otherwise, thank you to everybody for joining us today. Thank you to the speakers again, and thank you to the participants who took the time out to tune into this conversation. And we really look forward to having you guys on future calls moving forward. Thanks again, Colonel Wilkerson. Thanks again, Colonel Edgar. It really was a unique event.
Thanks to you all. Thank
Yeah.
you, Shlomo.
Thanks for having
Take
us.
care. Have a good weekend. All the best.
Everybody stay healthy.